I'm Mike Ward, and I chair the EMV Security Working Group. And in this presentation, I will provide you with information about the role of cryptography in EMV chip payment security. I'll describe the EMV chip security architecture in terms of how it uses symmetric cryptography for remote authentication of the card to its issuer, and how it uses public key cryptography for local authentication of the card to the terminal. I'll then get into some specifics of which algorithms are used for authentication. I'll divide these into old, by which I mean the ones used since the beginning of EMV 20 plus years ago, and new, by which I mean the ones introduced more recently. I'll conclude with a deeper dive into how cryptography is used in the new EMV contactless terminal application known as Kernel 8. I'll begin by describing at a relatively high level the security architecture for EMV chip transactions. A typical EMV transaction is where a consumer uses their payment card to buy something in a shop. So two necessary players in this transaction are the cardholder and the merchant. But the other critical players are their banks, the bank that issues the card to the cardholder, and the acquirer bank that sponsors the merchant to accept payment transactions. And last but not least, there is the payment network that provides value-added communications between acquirer and issuer. And this includes the payment network such as Amex, Discover, JCB, MasterCard, UnionPay, or Visa. Service providers may also be involved. During a payment transaction, the cardholder presents their card, or mobile device, to the merchant's terminal, and the terminal initiates a series of commands to the chip on the card, and the chip provides responses to the commands, culminating in purchase approval or decline, or what is most common nowadays, a request for the transaction to be sent online for approval by the issuer. Communications between chip and terminal is either contact where the chip card is actually inserted or dipped into the terminal reader, or contactless, where the card is simply waved close to the terminal reader and communication uses NFC, near-field communication. And of course, it is contactless communications that enable mobile phones to also be used as the consumer device instead of a plastic card. During a transaction, the card will, in response to an unpredictable challenge number from the terminal, create two types of cryptogram: an offline cryptogram that can be verified locally by the terminal, and an online cryptogram that can be verified remotely by the issuer. To avoid requiring that the card and terminal share secret keys, EMV uses public key cryptography for the local authentication. But because card and issuer can share secret keys, EMV defines the use of symmetric cryptography for remote authentication. I'll briefly describe each card authentication method in the next two slides. EMV local authentication depends on a pre-established PKI, a public key infrastructure, where the payment system has a key pair, the root key of the PKI, as does each issuer bank. And the issuer public key is certified by the payment system. The issuer generates a key pair for each card, and the card public key is certified by the issuer. The card keys and certificates are provisioned into the card, and the payment system public key is distributed to the acquirers and onward to the merchant terminals. Then, at a time of payment transaction, any merchant terminal possessing the payment system public key can, as part of local authentication, verify the certificate chain in order to authenticate the card's public key and the card itself. EMV remote authentication can instead use symmetric cryptography. The issuer can derive card master keys from its issuer master key using the card's account number as derivation data. Each card is then provisioned with its card master key before issuance to the cardholder. Later, during a payment transaction, the card derives a session key from its card master key using the card's transaction counter as derivation data, and then uses its session key to compute a MAC over transaction data that is sent to the issuer and can be verified by the issuer. Having provided an overview of the security architecture for EMV, we will now focus on the cryptographic algorithms used by EMV, and we'll do this in terms of old and new. By old, I mean the cryptography that was defined in EMV from the start, 25 years ago, such as RSA and two-key triple DES, and that is still used by most EMV transactions today. And by new, I mean algorithms such as elliptic curve cryptography and AES that have been included in the last 10 to 15 years and are not widely used yet by EMV transactions. I remark that the design of the new public key cryptography had its origins over a decade ago, when EMV was planning a new common specification for both contact and contactless. In the end, this initiative did not come to fruition, but the ideas for the cryptography did ultimately get added to the existing contact specifications in EMV Book 2 and to a new EMV contactless terminal application specification, so-called Kernel 8, as defined in the EMVC8 specification and EMV Book E. I'll begin by describing the old cryptography and the algorithms used for local authentication and remote authentication. Local authentication relies on public key certificates and a card digital signature generated using RSA and SHA-1 according to ISO IEC 9796-2. The card digital signature is of type DDA or CDA, depending on when in the transaction it happens and the amount of data authenticated by the signature. 2 points to note here are that the maximum RSA key size is 1984 bits, due to the maximum size of the card response message, and that the algorithm is mandatory and EMV type approved, so as to ensure global interoperability between cards and terminals that perform local authentication. Algorithms for remote authentication, on the other hand, are not mandated by EMV, but simply recommended, as their use is between the issuer and the issuer's cards. The old recommended algorithms are based on two-key triple DES and 8-byte MACs, generated using the so-called retail MAC algorithm, standardized in ISO 9797-1. I'll now describe the newer algorithms. The newer algorithms for local authentication use elliptic curve cryptography and the Schnorr variant of ECDSA for digital signatures, as defined in ISO IEC 14888-3 and using SHA-256 with NIST curve P256. Whereas contact transactions require the card to generate a digital signature known as XDA, similar in function to CDA, for contactless transactions, the card and terminal instead establish a secure channel using a blinded form of Diffie-Hellman, standardized in ISO IEC 11770-3, and the card generates a secure channel MAC called EDA MAC using the AES CMAC algorithm. I'll talk more about this later. For remote authentication, it is anticipated that issuers will use AES and CMAC, because these cryptographic functions will anyway be implemented on contactless cards for the local authentication. That said, for EMV, the actual algorithm used for remote authentication is simply recommended, not mandated. I'll now describe in more detail the cryptography defined by the new EMV contactless terminal application called Kernel 8. I'll start, though, with an overview of the security objectives and an illustration of the blinding of Diffie-Hellman key agreement. The security objective is to have a secure channel established between card and reader that provides authentication to the terminal of card and card data, and communications integrity, including a protocol to detect relay attacks, the so-called RRP, a protocol to help detect and thereby prevent relay attacks. As a reminder, a relay attack is typically where a fraudster makes a transaction at a legitimate merchant by relaying in real time the merchant terminal communications to a card of an unsuspecting cardholder. The relay introduces a communications delay, and this is what the relay resistance protocol detects. The secure channel also provides privacy protection. One of the important security objectives of Kernel 8 is to meet the requirements of the GDPR, the European General Data Protection Regulation, in terms of protection of PII, personally identifiable information. Hence, the secure channel also allows the encryption of card data sent from card to terminal, and goes further by allowing encryption of the card public key and its certificate, so as to prevent tracking and transaction linking by a passive eavesdropper. As shown by the diagram, this is especially relevant for contactless transactions because although the consumer device must be close to the merchant's reader, an eavesdropper can be much further away. I'll now provide you with a pictorial explanation of how blinded Diffie-Hellman works. As a preliminary, I'm sure you will recall that with ordinary Diffie-Hellman, two parties are able to establish a shared secret simply by exchanging their public keys. The public keys can both be ephemeral, or both be fixed, static, possibly certified, or they can be a mixture, with one static and the other ephemeral, as is essentially the case with EMV. So in this illustration of blinding Diffie-Hellman, we begin with the card on the left having a certified public key pair, and the terminal on the right has nothing. At the beginning of the transaction, the card multiplies its public key by a 32-byte random number, the so-called blind, and the terminal generates a random ephemeral key pair. They then perform Diffie-Hellman to establish a shared secret, actually an x-coordinate of a point on an elliptic curve from which they derive AES session keys, one for integrity protection and one for encryption, thereby providing for a secure channel for exchanging data between card and terminal. The important thing is that the card public key provided to the terminal is the blinded version of the card's certified public key. Some of you may have noticed that so far there is no way for the terminal to actually authenticate the card, as all it got from the card was a randomized public key that looked like an ephemeral public key. And that's the trick for blinded Diffie-Hellman. Once the secure channel is up and running, the card provides the public key certificates to the terminal so that the terminal can traverse the PKI in the usual way, but the card also provides the value of the random blinding number, thereby enabling the terminal to check that the randomized public key it received at the outset is indeed the card's certified public key multiplied by the random blinding number. Note that this way the card does not generate digital signatures, and neither the card account number nor the card public key are sent in the clear, and this prevents unwanted tracking by potential passive eavesdroppers. I think this is a beautifully efficient protocol and very easy. We now move deeper into the security and the cryptographic processes defined for Kernel 8. The left half of this slide highlights the security features of the C8 specification, but what I want to focus on is the flow diagram on the right. Stepping back, we can think of EMV as providing two-factor authentication, something you are or know in combination with something you have. The flow diagram on the right deals with the second factor, something you have. The first thing to mention is that the white boxes represent data or information, whereas the blue boxes represent functions. Then we see that the left blue box is the blinded Diffie-Hellman key agreement for establishing the encryption session key used for privacy and the macking session key used for integrity and authentication. Next, I draw your attention to the top white boxes. First, we have the card static data that is hashed by the terminal and used when processing the card public key certificate, but that is also fed into a MAC calculation along with the dynamic transaction data. This MAC is called the IAD MAC. The IAD MAC is central in many ways. It is fed into the EDA MAC, which provides for the local authentication, but it can also optionally be fed into the card online application cryptogram calculation, thereby providing the issuer with integrity assurance of all the local transaction data rather than only a small subset of it. So this means that if the data has been tampered with, then the application cryptogram verification will fail. In other words, remote authentication is then able to protect against any fraudulent manipulation of the local data exchange, and especially attacks that try to subvert the relay resistance protocol. I will now conclude my presentation with 3 slides that deal in more detail with blinded Diffie-Hellman, session key derivation, and finally the 2 MAC calculations. This slide shows again the blinded Diffie-Hellman protocol according to ISO 11770-3, but instantiated as in Kernel 8 using elliptic curve cryptography. As previously explained, the special version of Diffie-Hellman used here is blinded, meaning the card public key shared with the terminal is not the certified public key, but the certified public key multiplied by a one-time random number, R, the so-called blinding factor. This, in some sense, makes the card public key shared with the terminal like an ephemeral public key, and thereby the key agreement is ephemeral rather than static ephemeral. However, to achieve card public key authentication, the card provides to the terminal, inside the established secure channel, the blinding factor and public key certificate, thereby enabling the terminal to validate that the blinded key received in the first step of the protocol is indeed the product of the certified card public key and the blinding factor. As already noted, this method is very efficient and avoids the card having to generate digital signatures. And as you can see inside the red circle, there is a choice about how the card calculates the shared secret Z using scalar multiplications. I will now move on to explain how session keys are derived. In EMV kernel 8, the session key derivation is quite simple, albeit it is based on the more complex, flexible and generic methods defined in ISO 11770-6 and NIST Special Publication 800-108. Accordingly, key derivation starts by extracting a derivation key, KD, from the blinded Diffie-Hellman shared secret. Each kernel 8 session key is then derived by applying AES with the derivation key KD to derivation data, where the derivation data varies depending on whether the derived session key is to be used for encryption or authentication. This functionality is already included in the standard Java Card API. This is my final slide, and with this I want to briefly present the two MAC calculations involved in kernel 8. The top diagram shows the final block of the calculation of the local cryptogram that is verified by the terminal as part of local authentication. We refer to this cryptogram as the EDA MAC. And as you might guess from the left-hand side, XORing of two subkeys K1 or K2 with the final message block MN and the message chaining block HN-1, the MAC calculation is CMAC. The lower diagram shows the final block of the calculation of the IAD MAC. This is also a CMAC, but with a difference. As you can see in the lower diagram, the CMAC function used for the IAD MAC has been adjusted, augmented by including a feed forward on the last block to provide an element of irreversibility. In the EMV specifications, we denote the adjusted CMAC function as CMAC+. The reason for the adjustment is that we want the IAD MAC calculation to be a one-way function, like a hash function, whereas regular unadjusted CMAC is not a one-way function if a man-in-the-middle attacker knows the secure channel session keys. But for kernel 8, we want the IAD MAC to be secure against just such potential man-in-the-middle attackers, so that it can be relied on when used in remote authentication without local authentication. I won't say any more about CMAC+ here. But hopefully this and the rest of my presentation has provided you with some insights into the security design of EMV's new chip cryptography and contactless kernel 8. Further resources are available on our website. Don't forget to follow us on social media and subscribe to our Insights series online. You can also subscribe to our podcast from your preferred podcast provider. Thanks for your time.